So I recorded a video a little while ago trying to talk about the theory and practice of calculation in triple triad. And I think I did a really poor job, and so I haven't changed what my kind of lecture was for that at all, but I'm just going to skip over the practice parts because I think I did an inferior job at that and didn't describe things well. I also took too long talking about stuff, and I'm going to try to hurry it up a little. The reason I'm attempting a re-record, because I had kind of forgotten about doing this after my last catastrophe doing it, is there was some conversation about how far human players can actually calculate and how much they should be expected to see, especially at the best levels of human play. And Midas asked me to make a video on this, so I'm gonna try. So I think for some players, calculation is exhausting. It's one of the reasons, I think for all players, it's definitely at least tiring. But I think for some players, it's one of the main reasons closed can be so much more appealing, is calculation is a lot of work. It's less fun than kind of having an idea and playing that idea because you have to check everything. You have to be rigorous. It's really important in open play, and it can be a huge differentiator in quality of player. I think there are definitely players that get away with less calculation and go more on feel or have very strong heuristics. And there are players, probably like myself, that are more reliant on calculation, though that can also go along with being good at heuristics and feel as well. So I do think at every step of the game, calculation should be involved. Kind of checking, like, if I play a corner, what happens if they take my card? It's going to be a short calculation, but can be a very important one. And the better your heuristics are, the more precise your calculations are going to be. Often it's going to be something like, okay, they've played a corner, I play an adjacent corner. If they play the center square, the square in between, so not the center square, but the square in between our two corners, and I set up an L formation, do I then have resulting play from the L? So for instance, do I have a threatened 5 there? Do they not have a threatened 5 there? Have I successfully locked in a card such that they can't combo me? Things like that. That's all going to be calculation. And even if you're drawn to the adjacent corner by feel, to make it a good move, to consistently play good moves, all moves are going to require some calculation. But it is interesting because in the early game, we are not going to be able to reliably, or for some people ever, calculate out to the end of the game. And in the late game, this will be at different points for different players, but we can calculate out to a clear win, tie, or loss. While in the early game, it's often going to be, I think this is an advantage, or I think I should be able to hold this for a tie, or I think I'm in trouble no matter what, but this is complicated, right? There's some kind of evaluation that goes on in our head, which is how we select one move over another. And that evaluation can be in terms of advantage or complexity, or this looks fun. This looks more fun than other options, can also be a way people evaluate. And in the end game, that tends to turn into this is a win, a tie, or a loss. So we're going to look at this by talking about Calc 3, and then think about further calculations. So Calc 3 is how long does it take a player to calculate most 3 moves left positions. And I think calculation of 3 moves is a pretty useful indicator of how fast and well a player calculates. And from someone's Calc 3 time, we can figure out further calculation times. I think it's worth noting, I've been doing a lot of databases of players. Lots of players play imperfectly with 3 moves left, meaning often they play correctly, but there are occasional mistakes there with 5 and 7 minute timers. I'm going to be assuming players are much better and faster calculators than that. But if you are calculating Calc 3 reliably at the speeds I'm saying, you are a way above average calculator. That doesn't make you a top tier calculator. The best calculators are really, really good. But I think if you are calculating Calc 3 at the kinds of times I'm talking about, you're a very fast calculator, because most players are letting some mistakes slip into their play with 3 moves left in the game, and this assumes you won't no matter what the time control is. So I think there's also memory points are useful when calculating, which is when you've checked a move, when do you jump to the next move when you realize you don't have what you're looking for? So if you find a move that loses but is complex, and that's the first thing you look at, it is worth remembering that move is at least tricky. And so if you don't find anything better, you can come back to that. Because the problem is, and this came up when I was playing some 1-minute games against the computer, is in 1 minute I was able to calculate out every variation with 3 moves left, but I had forgotten which variation did what. And it ended up being, I had calculated, I think, 3 ties and 3 losses, but I completely forgot which was which and just played a move and it was one of the losses and lost a game I should never have lost because I didn't keep these memory points in mind. And so the thing I really should have done is number 2, once I had found a move that ties, I should have made sure that was locked into my head, even in a rush time, just locked it in as I know that move ties, I will play that move if I don't find anything else. If we can replace that with a move that ties and the tie is tricky, that's great. That's step 3. And if we find a winning move, we can stop thinking and just play that move. Though in a GB format or a trade diff situation where margin of victory matters, perhaps it is worth looking around for more or double checking to make sure it wins. But if we are confident a move wins, we can play it. But until then, we should keep in mind, I know this move ties. And even if we come into the easiest time to make this mistake, I think, is we come into a position looking for wins. And you look at a move and you realize it doesn't win. You see at least one tie for them, so you move on to the next move. But you never guaranteed that any of your moves on the way are at least a tie, because you kept moving to the next move to look for a win when you realize this one doesn't win. And you actually never guaranteed, if you're thinking this way, it's possible to do, that a move at least tied. And so I really think it's worth, you take a move, you realize it doesn't win, and you keep calculating a little longer to make sure it at least ties, and then you move on to the next one. And you also make sure to lock that move in your head as, this is my backup move in case I don't find anything. Of course, this means we often don't have to spend our full time to calculate 3 moves. Whatever your calc 3 time is, like if you can calculate any 3 move left position within 2 minutes, often you're going to be calculating it a lot faster than 2 minutes, because if the first move you check is the winning move, you might find it in 20 or 30 seconds and not need the full 2 minutes. But your calc 3 time is really when it's complicated, when it's tricky for you, what is the kind of maximal time it takes for you to calculate 3 moves left. Though you could also definitely do this as what is the average time it takes for you. And actually that might be a better way to do it. So I'm going to be saying that there's a baseline of 1 minute calc 3 scores, and I think that is much faster than most players. With 1 minute and with calc 3, so with 3 moves left, you have 2 cards in hand, and there are 3 squares you can play in. So that's 6 possible moves. Your opponent has 2 cards and 2 squares they can play in. So that's 4 possible replies to each of your moves, and the last move is forced at the end. So there's 24 total sequences. With 60 seconds to do it, and you have 10 seconds to check each of your 6 possible moves. And maybe guaranteeing you can calculate this within a minute is too much, but for this as an average time, if you are a good calculator, I think this is a reasonable aim to be able to do. To be able to check each of your 6 possible moves with 10 seconds for each. There aren't going to be that many replies. Some of them you can immediately dismiss. And hopefully, because you've played the game to this position, you'll be kind of aware of what the combo potential is from each of the cards. And so it won't be refinding the combos with each move. You're kind of aware of where the combo threats are. Now, in positions with lots of combos or weird endgame complexity, this might take longer. But in most positions, I think for the stronger end of players, this should be pretty doable. If this isn't doable for you, then set it at 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and I think that's still fine. I'm going to set a baseline of 1 minute because I want to be pushing this. I want to be making this a challenge. So if you can do a calc 3 in 1 minute, how fast can you do a calc 4? 4 moves left. There's going to be 3 cards in hand and 4 different squares to play in. So that is 12 potential moves. So each of those 12 moves leads to a calc 3. So it's going to be 12 times the possibilities. This is going to take 12 minutes to calculate everything. With 5 moves left, that's 15 times more. So it's going to be 3 hours to check all the possibilities. Now, 1 minute calc 3 is really fast. Now, there could definitely be players faster, 30 seconds, 15 seconds even. But even if you cut it down to like 6 seconds, you're 10 times the speed. That's still going to take 3/10 of an hour, that's going to take 20 minutes to calculate every possibility with 5 moves left, which is to say no human is doing it. And if any human claims they are, they either have, in like a 5 or a 7 minute game, they either have just an incredibly fast speed of calculation, or they're just not telling the truth. Now, what they might instead say is they are checking every important or relevant line, which I do think is doable, and we'll get more into that later. But this is to say, it is very possible in a 5 or 7 minute game for the fastest calculators to maybe check every possibility in a Calc 4 situation, and at least probably check every important variation in a Calc 4 situation. But again, as I mentioned in the chat today, I've been keeping records of open games, and of players I've seen who have played at least 10 open games, there are exactly 2 players who have made no mistakes in a Calc 4 situation, myself and Dalial, and I'm sure we will make some over time. We've made many in the past, we'll make many more in the future. This is to say, no human player, I think, is going to end up being perfect from Calc 4 situations. Especially when they start playing like 3 minutes and 2 minutes. But even in 5 minutes. And no one is going to see everything in a Calc 5 situation. But they may see all the important things. So if we look at various calc speeds, and the Calc 3 is how fast does it take you to calculate 3 move positions on average. So we have 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, 15 seconds. You can see how long it would take you to calculate everything with 4 moves left, everything with 5 moves left. You'll notice even in a 15-second Calc 3, that's already 45 minutes, way out of range. Everything with 6 moves left and everything with 7 moves left. And you'll notice if your Calc 3 is 10 minutes, this is taking more than 2 years to do. And if your Calc 3 is just mere 15 seconds, it's still taking you 21 days to do. This is to say, full calculation of a game is just not feasible for humans. It is very feasible for computers, but it is not feasible for human brains. This is just much too fast. So, from any starting position of Triple Triad, there are 5,225,472,000 possible paths for the game to take. Again, human mind just can't think that many things that quickly. With a 10-minute Calc 3, seeing an entire 9-move game covering every variation would take over 4,000 years. At 15 seconds, it would still take over a century. So humans are never going to calculate perfectly. There is never going to be a game where you've seen every possibility in every version from every direction. And that's okay. I think for a lot of players, most players who played for any length of time can calculate 2 moves perfectly, very reliably. And if you extend that to Calc 3, or you're good at Calc 3 and you can extend that to Calc 4 or get close to Calc 4, you can make big improvements in calculation, even though coming anywhere close to the entire game is ludicrously infeasible. And then the last sentence here is really important. After that calculation, we're going to have to rely on other understandings that will act as shortcuts, right? With 4 moves left, it might, with a 1-minute Calc 3 speed, which is, again, very fast, it would take you 12 minutes to check everything. But what if, this is a Q formation? There are kind of standard sequences of play from here, or a T formation, or, a Z, or some other formation you're familiar with. And like a long L, there are cards in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. And it's something you're familiar with, and you know where the critical squares are to look. Often these are the squares that lock cards in, right? If there are cards in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the squares you should check first are in 6 and 9, probably 9 first, because those are the squares that can potentially lock cards in. Now maybe, in 6, you have no move that locks in a card in 3. 3 is theirs, and you can't take it, or 3 is already yours, and they can never take it, so you can jump immediately to 9. And by doing this, by having a sense of where are the key squares to play in, you can get much faster. And I think for me, this was a big strength coming over from 2 things. One is, coming over from chess, I was always going to be good at calculating. And 2 is, starting by playing non-combo closed, I had a very good feel for the kind of fundamentals of Triple Triad, for where I was supposed to play. And I could check those cards first. And it meant it took me a while to start seeing more creative possibilities, to get new ideas in my head. But I had the fundamentals really well down, so I knew where the key squares to check were, and I could calculate more narrowly and thus go deeper. So yeah, calculating a whole game going to take a lot of time. We're never going to be seeing everything, and there's some text here, but seeing farther is obviously a big advantage, and you're not going to see everything. That's okay. I do think, however, that we can do some things with calculation. One is, if your Calc 3 or your Calc 4 time is less than the amount of time left, you should just go into brute force mode, right? You should just say, like, I know I can do Calc 3 in 3 minutes. I have 5 minutes on the clock. Instead of spending some time, like, kind of looking at moves vaguely in a disorganized way, I should just go through the moves. I know I can do it in 3 minutes and just guarantee I play the best move every time. And often it'll take you less than 3 minutes because you'll have found a win, or because some moves are kind of ludicrous and can be dismissed immediately. Because you've already found a tie, you start looking at a move, the first line you check with it loses, you don't have to check the other lines with that moves, it's a losing move. So I think one thing is, when the game is within range that you can just calculate it out, you should just calculate it out. You should, especially in a tournament format where the result really matters, you should just make sure you're making the best move. Even if it is tiring, so maybe don't do it in your casual games, but in tournament games and in some casual games, because it's good to be in practice, you want to make sure you're calculating what you can. And then I think you really want to lessen the load, because on 5th turn, there are 15 possible moves. There's 3 cards left and 5 squares to play in. There are 12 possible replies on the opponent's move 6, right? So between moves 5 and 6, there's 180 possibilities. But if you can identify, here are the 2 moves that clearly matter, and here are the 2 sensible replies by my opponent. Well, then we're down from 180 moves on 180 sequences on moves 5 and 6 to 4, right? Which means we have 4 sequences that reach a Calc 3. Suddenly, we can just do 4 Calc 3s and have correctly evaluated a position on 5th turn. And so instead of needing 3 hours, now it's just 4 minutes for a 1-minute Calc 3 player. So I do think there's a real value in trying to identify narrow, critical lines rather than trying to calculate everything. And I really try to do this in my play, and I think it is very apparent if you watch me analyzing, that I do not necessarily scan very broadly. I check what I think is a critical move, and I calculate that quite deeply. And I do that early on. I also often do that quite late, but you'll see it especially like me on move 2 or move 3. I'll try to identify a sequence that gets me as far into the game as possible, and all the moves seem logical to me. And so improving that core logic and that core sense of what moves matter will make you a much faster calculator, because it will mean you can calculate narrower lines instead of having to go broadly. So yeah, this is okay. I preceded my lecture notes. I had put this down a while ago, but clearly I think the same then as I think now. And I think many good players are able to do Calc 3 in 5 minutes, and there we should go broadly. We should make sure we check everything because we have the time to do so. Once we know we will never have the time to do so at Calc 5, and we may not have the time to do so at Calc 4, we should start being more specific. Now, if you can do so at Calc 4, then definitely do so at Calc 4. But for most players, that's not going to be the case. So there, we should check the key lines, but we should check them to the end. We should get to the end as frequently as we can. Calc 5, basically no one's ever going to be able to Calc 5 everything. So again, it's identifying those key lines, here are the key variations, and making sure you calculate those deeply. So if it's short term and we know we can do it, go broad, get everything. If it's longer term and it's never going to be feasible to calculate everything, then go narrow and deeply and get it right. Yeah, so this one is just saying we want to increase our calculations everywhere, right? And calculations early on, instead of ending the game with an evaluation like win, loss, or tie, it will end the game with that Z looks promising, or I've locked in a card and they haven't, or I have more combo squares than they do. It is okay to end a calculation with that kind of thing. And if it turns out you evaluated that position, you get to that position, and that position turns out to be bad, then what we should change is not our calculation, because you got the critical moves right. What we should then change is our evaluation. So I'm sort of identifying 3 key skills here. One is candidate moves. Which moves do I think are important? Which moves do I think are the important replies? If you regularly make moves and good players respond with something you did not consider at all, probably the weakness is in candidate moves. Then there's calculation. You take a line and you follow it out. How well can you see it? How precisely can you see to the end of the game? This you can very much check pretty quickly by taking a few kind of complex Calc 3 positions and seeing how long it takes you to calculate everything or calculate to the correct result. And if that takes you, 1 minute or thereabouts, you're a very good calculator. If that takes you more like 2 minutes to 3 minutes, you're probably... I have no idea what the average range on Triple Triad Advanced is, but I would say that's still probably an above average calculator. And once you get below that, then calculation probably isn't your strength, or you are not an above average open player or an average open player, which is fine. Many players aren't. Open is not played that often, and a ton of the games are played by people like Delial, who's obviously massively above average. And then the third skill here is evaluation, right? You can see the key moves, the moves that make the most sense with the logic of the position. That doesn't mean they're good or bad necessarily, right? A key move to check might be one that loses, but it is the type of move that could easily be winning or important in this position, so it has to be checked, even if in this case it doesn't work. So the third is evaluation. In the end game, we're evaluating to a win, tie, or loss. There's nothing to judge there. Win is better than tie, tie is better than loss. Early on, though, it might be something like, in this variation, I lock in a card, but the rest of my cards are directionally bad. In this other variation, I don't lock in anything, but I think I keep better sweepers for the endgame. Stuff like that. Or I set up a T that looks really good for me. Or, anything like that. Any kind of evaluation. It looks like a really combo-y game, and I think I have more ways to combo 5. Something like that, right? We have lots of ways to evaluate. And some people will head for positions and then realize once they get there that they're bad, or they're not as good as they expected, or that they're much better than they expected, which is still an evaluation mistake. And so I think these are the 3 skills, 3 core skills: candidate moves, calculation, and evaluation. And here I'm mostly talking about calculation, but they all flow into each other. So I guess I then listed out these 3 main skills. Yeah, very much on the same page with myself. That is nice to see. So evaluations, really having good heuristics and guidelines to what makes for an advantage and what doesn't, is really useful. And also, of course, helps you see candidate moves quickly. One heuristic I standardly use is if the opponent plays a corner starter and I can take it one way, so opponent plays a corner starter. If I can take it neither way, the first thing I do is check, do I have a move in 5 that sets me up to take both ways, because it's the only way I can attack their starter both ways. If I can take it one way, the first thing I look at is, am I happy with that one way I can take it? Let's assume I am. Then I'll look at the adjacent corner that attacks is near the side I can't take to see if I can set up that way to sort of attack from the angle I can't take. And this is one heuristic I use for which moves do I look at first. We're not going to calculate everything, so we're going to need candidate move principles that help us get to which moves matter here. So there are so many ways that things could matter. Here are a few examples, and this is going to help us identify which are the key moves to evaluate, right? If there's a card in 1 and I'm considering playing in 2, what moves of theirs do I need to calculate? I'm thinking I want to play in 2 and capture their starter. Which moves matter? So 1, moves that are safe or protect our other cards. Or, for their moves, protect their other cards. So a move that is safe or protects a card there, they might have safety in 3, in the example where there are cards in 1 and 2. That only is 1 out facing, so that's a square kind of likely to be safe. And they might protect one of their cards. They might go in 4 and lock in the card in 1. So 3 and 4 are likely moves for them to play. Next, moves that can recapture or combo back other captures. So if they've played in 1 and we've played in 2, maybe they could play in something like 6, or maybe they could play in 3 and combo our card in 2 to flip the card in 1. Or a recapture would be in 4. Again, 3 and 4 seem the most likely moves. Moves that create more combo synergies. This is most likely to occur in 6 in that situation, because 6 can set up both ways against our card in 2. Moves that deny our opponent safety, or in their case, deny us safety. When we play in 2 after they've gone in 1, we might threaten to play in 4 and lock in the card in 1. So them going in 4 before us denies us safety. And so we can see when there are cards in 1 and 2, the most likely squares by far are 3 or 4, with 6 as the tertiary option. More complexly, moves that deny our opponent a square they intend to use. I just played a game against Chickeny that the computer says I missed a win on move 3, and I was never going to find it, but it does follow this principle, which is I had played a card in 9, and he played a card in 6, not capturing my card in 9. But if I wanted to lock in my card in 9 from 8, again, a clear candidate move. We see why that would matter based on the first principles. He would now have 5 combo setups that could then flip the card in 9. And so the computer's solution to my position that I wouldn't see, because it looks kind of crazy on the above principles, is just to block 5 and take away those future combos from him. And it ended up working out in that position. Again, I didn't see it. It is a weird move to make, but it is something that can sometimes come up. If there is a square that is really good for them to combo on later and bad for us to combo on, then just closing that square out of the game, sticking a card there, it's a complicated move type. It's very difficult to find. It can be a very strong move. Moves that leave open squares that may prove valuable later. In my example of if there are cards in 1 and 2, maybe there's a big combo in 3. But maybe leaving that as a threat is even better than using it now. And moves that get cards out of our hand with little endgame play. So in the example of there are cards in 1 and 2, maybe every single card can recapture from 4 in the person's hand that's on first turn and going next. Every single card can capture in 4. Which card do we want to use? Well, we want to check what can be comboed, what sets up combos for us. But another thing we want to do is, the game's probably headed up left. So maybe we want to use one of the cards in our hand that doesn't play well going up or left or both, because that is a card that's probably not going to prove as useful later. So there's lots of reasons to make a move. This is just some examples. Triple Triad's a very complicated game. But focusing on some, I think especially the first 4, is likely to tell you, okay, if I go here, what's the move they're most likely to do? And then what can I do against that? And again, we can start calculating more narrowly and try to get to an evaluation. So this slide you can pause on if you want, but I just was saying that if you have a good feel for certain formations, it becomes much quicker to calculate them because you know how play tends to go in them, so you can again narrow lines more rapidly. I think this is not a question I'm sure on the answer of, but if you have reliable Calc 4, so you're going to be perfect from move 6 on, then on second turn, you're really only playing 2 moves of the game. You're playing move 2, you're playing move 4, and then you are calculating to the end and guaranteeing those moves are good. So if you can, with your second move, have set up a clear plan for move 4, you can sort of sequence the game into 2 parts. Your initial plan, a logical, hopefully effective sequence, and then your endgame calculation. And so I kind of think as a calculator, you want to play forcefully earlier so that you can have logically reached a position where you enter your calculation phase and are pretty sure your opening play is sound. That's my inkling. I might be wrong, and I do think that sounds a little counterintuitive, so maybe scratch that part. Then I gave some examples and kind of trying to calculate 3 moves deep. And I don't actually perfectly remember where I was going with this, but I think the idea was if we capture their starter, we can force a 3-move sequence and give an evaluation at the end. And I think my idea here, and I have not looked, but I think my idea was to play 5, 7, 5, 2, and 4. We capture their starter. We know their key moves are going to be in 2 and in 7. 2 more likely because it locks in a card. Their most likely reply is 2, 6, 3, 6, and 2. And then we can play 7, 5, 5, 2 in 7. And we have set up an L formation. They do not have anything in 5, right? That 7 out is very safe. So they have locked in 1 card, and we have 2 cards. One of them they can't take, and one of them is kind of tough for them to take. Their only way to take our 7, 5, 5, 2, and 7 is 3, 2, 7, 6 in 8. And there we can combo back with either 5, 2, 5, 7, and 5, or 5, 4, 4, 5, and 5. So that card's probably safe too. So we can sort of calculate this opening sequence just saying, I know when I go in 4, 2 is their main move. Then I can set up an L. Hopefully I know that L's are a good formation and can see that looks like a very promising L from which I can play for a tie or a win. So we look to, maybe we have a heuristic. In my lesson on capturing opposing corners, one of my main heuristics was if you can capture with a high number towards 5 that you don't think they'll be able to take, or you can force them to recapture with a high number towards 5 themselves, you can often set up a really good L. And we can see that here. So we have this idea. I can capture their starter with a high number towards 5, 5, 7, 5, 2. When they recapture, I can then set up the L, and that high number towards 5 will be safe now. They won't be able to take it. So I have this immediate instinct, this might be a good move. Then we know what the key moves are. We know my first move's in 4. Their key move's going to be recapturing in 2, locking in the card. And I know I'm looking to set up an L, specifically an L where they can't take my card from 5. If I went in 3 at the end there, their card in 2 is a 3 facing down. They can capture that lots of ways. Well, if I go in 7, it's a 7 facing in. They can't capture that at all. So that seems the way to do it. So I do think the 5, 7, 5, 2, and 4, they go 2, we go 7 sequence is really strong. But we do need all 3 parts to it. We need to see this as a candidate move. We need to calculate 3 moves deep, knowing which the main moves are. And we need to evaluate at the end, this looks like a promising L. And that is helped by being able to calculate just a little further, seeing that they're capturing 8 at the end, we can combo back. So this goes over kind of what we want. And here's kind of when the L is set up, what we want is to have a safe card and to control 5, and we do. They don't have a good move for 5. And so I give some write-ups, but I don't want to spend too long on this. But it is to say, if they go in 3, 5, 6, or 9, they have just let us go in 2 for free, locking in a card. These moves are really unlikely to be good. Occasionally they are. There are certain players who are very good at finding moves in those squares, but they're unlikely to be good. They're not the lines we need to spend time checking. We need to check 2 and 7. Those are the moves that matter. And being able to get down to which moves matter and calculate deeply there is, as I've said, really important. And yeah, we get the line that I said where we have a quite good position and we can force it out of the opening. And if we have perfect 4-move calculation after their next move, we'll be able to get the correct result every time. And so this is how I think, something I think good calculators should be biased to do, is play in forcing ways that gets the game kind of safely into their calculation range as quickly as possible. And obviously there's the same number of moves every game, but here with our move in 4, we really set up our next move in 7 and led us into the move 6 and on stage where we can just calculate. So here's an example of a calculation, which you can do. It's a Calc 4. I think timing how long it takes you to either check everything or get the right solution is useful and might be a good thing to do. I think in my first video attempt, I tried to talk through this position and it just took way too long talking through it because again, 1 minute Calc 3 means this takes 12 minutes to do. I'm going to be slower when talking it out. So it was kind of a slog. So we'll skip past this. Then I asked what happens if they block 5 with 3, 2, 7, 6. What should we think about? And I won't go through the calculation again, because again, that was a slog when I tried to do that. But I will say when they go 3, 2, 7, 6, and 5, we should first identify which squares are likely to be best for us. And that should be quick to answer. That's definitely 3 and 8. Those are the squares that can lock things in and are most interactive with the board. That doesn't mean we have to go in 3 or 8 every time. It doesn't mean we take the first capture we see, but it means those are the squares likely to be critical. And so starting with those, and going as far as we can, I think, is a useful way to use our calculating time. And we have some memory points here, so if you want to pause and figure out the position, go for it. I'm not going to here. And I think that's my last slide. So I guess we talked about calculation of the whole game, or even a huge chunk of it, just not feasible, not humanly doable. It's not one of those things of like, but what if we had lots more people playing? Surely we'd have better players at the top end, because the larger number of people playing a game, the more it pushes the talent upwards. But these are just infeasible numbers. They're not happening. What you can instead hope to do is have really good calculation, be really reliable at Calc 3, maybe be really reliable at Calc 4, and occasionally achieving some deep looks from Calc 5 or further. And you should always be calculating from there too, and calculating from the early game. But along with calculation, we're going to need to identify what are the key moves, both so we're checking the key moves for ourselves, but also checking the key replies for our opponents, and calculating those narrow lines much more deeply. And getting better at evaluation, just getting better feelings for different structures. I either made a video or have a video coming out soon on what I call the center attack, where the person starts in 5, and whatever the opponent does, they then play next to that card. And one of the benefits of this is it guarantees the same position type after 3 moves. And so you could get really used to finding moves in those position types that are really strong and get better at that kind of setup. And I think training yourself to play different setups is a really useful thing, and having a feel for them. And so I thought that might be a useful idea for someone. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about calculation. I hope this didn't meander too much. I think I did a somewhat better job than the first time I tried to record this. And it took under an hour this time, so that's great. Cheers.